When you picture kids in ancient Egypt, you probably imagine little princes in gold jewelry, walking through temples, or playing beside pyramids. But that wasn't real life for most of them. The average Egyptian child didn't grow up in palaces. They grew up in villages of mudbrick houses, waking up to the sound of roosters, goats, and their mother grinding grain before sunrise. Their toys were made from river clay. Their games were played barefoot in the dirt. And their world revolved around one thing: the Nile. A normal morning for a child in ancient Egypt started early. The sun rose fast and hot, so people worked before the heat became unbearable. Kids usually slept on woven mats with their families in small windowless rooms. There were no doors with hinges, no quiet mornings. Life began when everyone else started moving: parents, siblings, animals. By the time the first light hit the mud-brick walls, the house was alive. Mothers baked flatbread in outdoor clay ovens. Fathers carried tools to the fields, and kids were expected to help, no matter how small they were. There were no lazy mornings in ancient Egypt. Before a child could even read or write, they were already learning how to carry water jars, fetch firewood, or herd ducks and goats near the river. That was life training, not punishment. Every chore had a purpose. It taught discipline, responsibility, and survival. And when kids weren't helping, they were copying what adults did. They followed their parents to markets, watched them trade goods, or tagged along to fields just to learn by watching. But that doesn't mean their lives were miserable. Once chores were done, the rest of the day was theirs. And kids in ancient Egypt knew how to have fun. They played games that looked surprisingly familiar: tag, wrestling, and races. They threw clay balls, made toy boats from papyrus reeds, and even played board games like Senet, a kind of ancient version of checkers that adults love too. Archaeologists have found clay dolls with real hair made of string, wooden animals on wheels, and little carved cats and dogs. Toys weren't bought. They were handmade, often by parents. A father might carve a spinning top from scrap wood while his son watched. A mother might shape a doll from river clay, bake it in the sun, and paint it with charcoal for eyes. And the Nile was every kid's playground. After work, children ran to the riverbanks to swim and cool off. They learned to swim before they could write their own names. The river gave them everything: water to drink, fish to eat, mud to play with. Of course, it also hid crocodiles, so parents constantly shouted warnings that kids sometimes ignored anyway. Even 3,000 years ago, kids didn't always listen. Egyptian childhood was loud, full of laughter, and short. Most children didn't wear much clothing. It was too hot for that. Until around 6 or 7, they ran around naked, wearing only a small charm around their neck or waist. The most common was the Eye of Horus, believed to protect from sickness and evil spirits. Others wore amulets shaped like scarabs or small gods. The point wasn't decoration, it was protection. Parents couldn't keep their kids safe from disease or snakes or floods, so they put their faith in the gods instead. The home of an average child was simple: mud brick walls, reed roofs, a few clay jars for food, and mats for sleeping. Furniture was rare. Maybe a low stool or a chest for storage. Families often shared 1 or 2 rooms, so kids grew up surrounded by people. Privacy didn't exist. You heard every laugh, argument, and prayer. And because most houses were small, a lot of life happened outside: cooking, washing, talking, and playing in the courtyards. Religion was part of everything, even for kids. From the moment they could talk, they learned the names of the gods. They knew Ra ruled the sun, Osiris ruled the afterlife, and Isis protected families. The stories of the gods weren't just myths, they were lessons. Parents used them to explain the world: why the sun rose, why people died, why good things or bad things happened. Kids learned early that life had rules, both earthly and divine. Break the gods' rules, and you risked chaos. Most children never went to school, but that didn't mean they didn't learn. If your family were farmers, you learned farming. If your father was a carpenter, you learned to carve. Egypt ran on apprenticeships. Boys followed their fathers to workshops or fields. Girls stayed home and learned how to cook, weave, and care for younger siblings. Work wasn't separate from childhood. It was childhood. But that didn't stop them from laughing, playing, or sneaking away to swim when no one was watching. For the few lucky ones, education looked different. Wealthy boys were sent to scribal school, where they spent long hours sitting cross-legged on the ground, copying symbols on limestone chips. Their tools were reed pens and ink made from soot. Teachers didn't tolerate laziness. Ancient Egyptian writing exercises found by archaeologists are full of complaints from students. The teacher beats me when I write badly, and warnings from teachers. Do not waste the ink or you will be struck. But the reward was worth it. A scribe's life was comfortable and respected. They worked in shade, not in the sun, and their handwriting carried power. Girls didn't go to those schools, but they weren't powerless. Egyptian women had more rights than most in the ancient world. They could own property, manage businesses, and even become priestesses. Girls learned by example from their mothers and grandmothers. They learned how to run a home, mix herbs for healing, and make linen from flax. By the time they reached their teens, most were skilled enough to run households of their own. Family life centered around routine. Meals were simple: bread, onions, dates, and beer for adults. Kids drank watered-down beer or milk when they could get it. Everyone ate with their hands, sitting on mats, often from shared bowls. There were no clocks, no schedules. The people lived by the rhythm of the sun and the river. When the Nile flooded, families worked together to move goods to higher ground. When it receded, everyone helped plant crops. Kids weren't sheltered from any of it. They were part of it. At night, life slowed down. Families gathered around oil lamps made from clay. The air smelled like smoke and bread. Mothers hummed while weaving or braiding their daughters' hair. Fathers told stories, not fairy tales, but myths about gods, heroes, and the afterlife. For kids, those stories were both bedtime entertainment and life lessons. They learned that kindness mattered, that the heart would one day be weighed against a feather, and that a good life was one that stayed balanced. Most children didn't think much about the future. They didn't dream of becoming pharaohs or nobles. They just hoped for a good harvest, steady work, and safety. But no matter how poor a family was, they believed life had meaning. The gods were always watching, and every act, even a child's mischief, mattered. By the time an Egyptian child reached 12 or 13, childhood was over. Boys started full-time work. Girls prepared for marriage. There were no teenage years, no slow transition into adulthood. The world didn't wait. But in that short time before responsibility took over, Egyptian children found joy in small things. The splash of the Nile, the warmth of sunlight on mud walls, the sound of laughter echoing through narrow streets. And even though thousands of years have passed, it's hard not to see a little bit of us in them. Kids playing, parents worrying, families working, all trying to make life a little better than yesterday. Ancient or not, that part never changes. For kids in ancient Egypt, growing up happened quickly. Childhood wasn't a stage you eased out of. It was something that ended the moment you could work. But in between the chores, the laughter, and the long days under the sun, there was a rhythm that made life feel steady. Every day was a mix of small joys and serious lessons, and every child knew that one day soon, they'd be expected to carry their share of Egypt's endless workload. A normal day for an older child started with the heat. The sun rose over the Nile before anyone was ready for it. The first sounds were the same every morning. Donkeys braying, the splash of water jars being filled, mothers calling kids' names before breakfast. Meals were simple. Bread made from barley or emmer wheat, maybe a few dates if the family had them. Kids usually ate whatever adults didn't finish. sometimes dipping bread in oil or honey when they were lucky. There were no plates, no silverware, just hands, laughter, and a lot of crumbs on the floor. After breakfast, kids went to work. There was no free morning or lazy afternoon. Boys followed their fathers to the fields, carrying tools or leading animals. They learned how to plow the earth with oxen, how to tell when crops needed water, and how to work under the brutal sun without wasting energy. Farming wasn't just labor, it was survival. If the harvest failed, everyone suffered. Even small children were expected to do their part, gathering sticks, carrying baskets, or scaring birds away from the crops. In the villages, the air was thick with dust and the sound of people shouting instructions. Work and play often mixed together. Kids teased each other while hauling grain or racing to fetch water. Every task became a challenge. Who could finish first? Who could carry more? For a few moments, the burden of survival felt like a game. Girls worked just as hard, though their tasks looked different. They stayed closer to home, grinding grain with heavy stones until their arms ached, fetching water from the river, weaving baskets, or taking care of younger siblings. Some helped their mothers make beer, a thick, grainy drink that everyone consumed daily. Brewing meant mixing soaked bread and water, letting it ferment in clay jars, and hoping it didn't turn sour in the heat. Girls learned to do it by watching, not reading. Egypt didn't have recipes. It had memory. And in the middle of all this work, there was discipline. Egyptians believed children needed guidance to become decent adults. Respect for elders was everything. You didn't argue with your parents, and you definitely didn't talk back to a teacher. In schools, teachers used sticks. At home, parents used words first, and if that failed, sticks too. The idea wasn't cruelty. It was order. Ancient Egyptian writings say things like, "A boy's heart is shaped by instruction," and "He who listens to his father lives long." Still, there was warmth behind that discipline. Parents weren't emotionless. They were strict because the world outside was harsh. A child who didn't learn early wouldn't survive later. And while modern ears might hear those ancient sayings as cold, they were really about love. A practical, protective kind of love that came from living in a place where one bad season could ruin everything. Despite the hard work, kids found time to have fun. The Egyptians weren't all serious and solemn. They enjoyed life whenever they could. Children played games with sticks and hoops, wrestled in the sand, and swam in the canals. They played a version of tug-of-war, practiced balancing on reeds, and even danced to flute music in the evenings. When work ended, the streets filled with laughter. And then there were pets, real ones. Egyptian kids loved animals. Cats, dogs, monkeys, even gazelles were kept as companions. Cats especially were treated almost like family members. They protected grain from rats, but they also brought comfort. Kids played with them, fed them scraps, and gave them names that showed affection, like Little One or Moon. When a pet died, families sometimes buried it and left offerings, proof that even in ancient times, kids cried over animals the same way they do now. Religion was part of every child's day, too. Before eating, before sleeping, before leaving home, parents might say a short prayer or touch an amulet for luck. Kids grew up seeing this as normal. They didn't question it. It was just how life worked. When something went wrong, sickness, bad weather, or injury, it wasn't random. It was the gods sending a message. So children learned early that being good wasn't just about obeying parents. It was about keeping the gods happy. That meant being honest, respectful, and kind, because even the smallest act mattered in the eyes of the divine. The gods themselves weren't scary. Kids grew up with them as part of the family. Bas, the funny-looking dwarf god, was a favorite protector of children and homes. His face was carved on walls, toys, and even mirrors. Parents told their kids he watched over them at night, keeping away bad dreams. Tauret, the hippo goddess of mothers and babies, was another comforting figure. For a child, the gods were both teachers and guardians. Some kids did go to school, mostly the sons of scribes or priests. Their days were long, quiet, and full of repetition. Imagine a dozen boys sitting cross-legged in a temple courtyard, scratching lines into broken pottery shards while a teacher watched closely. There were no pencils, no notebooks, just reeds dipped in black ink. The lessons weren't about creativity. They were about discipline. Students copied moral sayings, multiplication tables, and records of taxes. The lucky ones went on to become scribes, men who wrote letters, counted goods, and helped run the kingdom. But most students didn't make it that far. Many dropped out early or returned home to help their families. For girls, school was rare. Their education came from home, passed from mother to daughter. They learned practical skills, cooking, sewing, using herbs for medicine. But that didn't mean they lacked intelligence. Egyptian women managed businesses, owned property, and ran estates. So girls grew up knowing they could handle responsibility, just not with reed pens and tablets. By midday, most work stopped. The heat was too much, so families rested inside their homes or under small awnings. Kids dozed off or played quietly with toys made of clay or bone. The sound of the river drifted through the air. Sometimes they listened to their parents talk about the harvest, about the pharaoh's latest decree, about prices in the market. Even if they didn't understand it, they absorbed it all. It was education without books, learning through life itself. As the sun went down, kids ran errands again, bringing food to neighbors, refilling water jars, feeding animals. When night came, families gathered for dinner under lamplight. Mothers told stories, fathers gave advice, and the younger children fell asleep halfway through. There were no lamps glowing late into the night, no screens, no distractions. Just the slow fading of firelight and the sound of the Nile outside. That was what average childhood looked like in Egypt, short, busy, and surprisingly full of warmth. Kids laughed, fought, played, and dreamed, just like any others. Their world might have been built from mud and faith, but it was alive. And even though they grew up fast, they carried those small joys with them. The smell of bread baking, the splash of the river, the sound of their mother's voice in the evening. Because long before childhood was defined, the kids of ancient Egypt had already lived it. By the time an Egyptian child reached 12 or 13, everything changed. Childhood didn't fade away slowly. It ended overnight. There were no birthdays, no ceremonies, no celebration to mark the shift. The next, you were working beside your father in the fields, or helping your mother prepare for your wedding. It sounds harsh, but for them, that was just life. Time didn't feel long in ancient Egypt. It was measured by the flood of the Nile, the growth of crops, and the strength of your hands. For boys, becoming an adult meant work, real work, the kind that broke your back but kept your family alive. Most took over their father's trade. If your family farmed, you farmed. If they fished, you fished. A few boys learned skilled crafts like carpentry, metalwork, or pottery. Those jobs took patience and strength, but they gave stability. Apprenticeships began early, and by the time a boy hit his teens, he was already expected to be good at something. Some were luckier. The sons of scribes or priests didn't have to dig or plow. They spent their teenage years with reed pens and clay tablets, writing tax records, copying prayers, and learning from older officials. It wasn't easy, but it was safer than the fields. Still, even for them, responsibility came fast. Egyptians believed that being an adult wasn't about age. It was about being useful. And in a world where the Nile decided everything, every pair of hands counted. For girls, the path was different but just as demanding. They learned early how to run a household, grinding grain, baking bread, spinning linen, caring for younger siblings. And by their early teens, many were already preparing for marriage. Most girls married around 14 or 15, often men several years older. Marriage wasn't about romance. It was about family, stability, and survival. But that doesn't mean there wasn't love. Some letters and poems from that time show affection between couples. People writing things like, "I wish you would come home soon, for I cannot eat when you are gone." So while marriage came early, emotion was still there. For both boys and girls, faith guided the transition into adulthood. Religion wasn't something you discovered. It was something you grew into. Kids who once played with amulets and charms now took part in rituals. They learned to pray to the gods of their trade, to thank Ra for each sunrise and Osiris for the harvest. They memorized moral teachings that reminded them to stay humble, work hard, and respect their parents. One common text told young people, "Do not forget the mother who raised you, for she carried you and gave you life." In a culture that worshipped order and family, that kind of message mattered. Death was never far away in Egypt, so even kids understood the idea of the afterlife. They grew up hearing about the weighing of the heart, how, after death, a person's soul was judged by Mat, the goddess of truth and balance. If your heart was heavy with wrongdoing, you were doomed. If it was light and pure, you entered the eternal fields, Egypt's version of paradise. That idea followed them from childhood to adulthood. It shaped how they behaved, how they treated others, and how they raised their own kids one day. Despite the hard work and early responsibilities, Egyptian children weren't robbed of happiness. They found it in small things, swimming in the Nile, laughing with siblings, feeding animals, or sitting with family under the stars. Nighttime was when life slowed down. The desert air cooled, oil lamps flickered, and the sound of insects replaced the noise of the day. Parents told stories about the gods, how Isis protected her child Horus from danger, or how clever children could outsmart chaos itself. Those stories weren't just entertainment, they were comfort. They told every Egyptian kid that courage and goodness mattered, even if life was hard. As children grew into adults, they didn't leave their families behind. Homes in Egypt stayed full. Parents, grandparents, children, and grandchildren often living under one roof or side by side. Family wasn't just important, it was everything. A person without family was considered incomplete. Children cared for aging parents, and in return, they inherited not just land or tools, but stories and lessons. The unbroken rhythm of life along the Nile. Looking back now, it's easy to imagine ancient Egyptian childhood as something distant, strange, foreign, maybe even harsh. But when you strip away the temples, the gods, and the hieroglyphs, what you find underneath is something familiar. Kids who laughed when they weren't supposed to. Parents who worried. Families who worked too hard, but still found time to sit together when the day was done. The details change, but the feelings don't. The average child in ancient Egypt didn't dream of glory. They dreamed of growing up, having their own home, and raising their own kids safely. They wanted food on the table, peace in the household, and maybe a cat that didn't steal their dinner. That was their version of success. And in a way, it worked, because those children grew up to build and maintain one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. Their world was small. A few streets, a few gods, a single river. But they built something eternal inside it, a sense of order, family, and meaning that has survived for thousands of years. Because in the end, ancient or modern, a child's life has always been about the same thing, learning how to grow up in a world that never stops moving.